if you were sitting next to a loved one, like right there in a coma, and you only had one tool left to pull them back to the waking world,
Right.
what story would you tell them? And I guess maybe more importantly, how would you tell it?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Yeah.
Our mission today is to explore this profoundly emotional set of excerpts from a work titled A Father's Promise at the ICU Bedside. We're specifically looking at the foreword in Chapter 1.
Which is just, I mean, it's heavy stuff.
It really is. What we have in these sources is this totally unique blending of real-world grief and, well, a gripping, fictionalized narrative. So we are going to examine the literal raw data of a family's actual history and see how that exact history transforms into a story of survival, of sudden tragedy, and just the absolute power of memory. Okay, let's unpack this.
Because, it really begins before Chapter 1 even starts. In the foreword, the author just completely refuses to hide behind the safety of fiction.
Yeah, she doesn't hold back at all.
Not at all. She steps right out and immediately tells you the emotional cost of writing this book. She describes traveling through the chapters of her parents' lives as this rewarding but incredibly difficult ride.
Which makes sense.
Right, and she explicitly states that the process gave her the precious gift of more time with her father before he passed away. And she shares this incredibly intimate detail about how, even while they laughed about the good times, she would see tears in her father's eyes when they discussed the hard times that he and her mother endured.
That transparency is just so striking. And she uses this phrase to describe her parents' collective lives, right?
Yeah.
She calls it the raw data for the story.
Yes. The raw data.
I love that phrasing because it sounds so clinical almost.
Yeah.
But in this context, it is just overflowing with emotion.
Yeah.
It is almost like she's acting as an alchemist.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. Like she is taking the unfiltered reality, the tears, the laughter, the heavy lead of actual trauma, and she's actively forging it into the gold of the narrative we are about to read.
And to ground that reality, she provides this huge roll call of the people who held her up while she was processing this raw data. And what stands out isn't just that she thanks people, but the sheer scope of the support system she names.
It's massive. She doesn't just thank her immediate family. I mean, she lists her husband, Ron, her oldest brother, Richard.
Right.
But then she expands it to her sisters-in-law, Diane, Christine, and Chantal. She specifically mentions nieces and nephews, too, pointing out Robin Sampson.
That's the daughter of her deceased brother, right?
Yeah, exactly, who was the very first person to read the manuscript. She thanks lifelong friends and even the publishing team at Balboa, naming Richard Belfoy, Chelina Sioko, and her copy editor, Sigrid MacDonald.
When you look at that list as a whole, it just proves that surviving grief takes an entire village. It isn't just a polite acknowledgement page, It's a map of her lifelines.
Definitely. It really is like, well, reading this forward is like examining the emotional foundation of a house before walking through the front door. It completely colors how you experience the story that follows.
Exactly. And the emotional core of this foreword really rests in the dedication itself. She dedicates the book to her mom for her collaborative inspiration. And then she writes, "To Roger Belfoy, my father, my hero."
Oh, wow.
Followed by this very specific piece of advice he gave to his grandsons before his death.
Right. I have it here. He said, cry when you are happy, when you're sad, fight it.
What's fascinating here is how the author is explicitly framing the upcoming narrative. She is giving us the thematic rulebook for the entire story before the plot even begins.
A rule book for grief, basically.
Yeah, Roger's advice to his grandsons establishes a psychological baseline for the resilience we are about to see in Chapter 1. It tells you, the reader, that tears of joy are permitted, but sorrow is an opponent. It requires active combat.
That mandate to fight sorrow is put to the ultimate test almost immediately, because the author doesn't start the story in the ICU or like in the middle of a battle.
No, she starts it in the most dangerously safe place imaginable.
A boring Friday commute. We step into Chapter 1 and meet Lucy. She is wrapping up this totally ordinary day at her office in Kingston, Ontario. She says goodbye to her secretary, Wendy. She calls her husband, Mark, who's a defense lawyer, and tells him not to work too hard.
The absolute picture of routine.
It is so specific and grounded. She is heading to her hometown of Alexandria, which we learn is about an hour from Ottawa, and was a tiny town of only 1,000 inhabitants when she was growing up.
Just a tiny place.
Yeah, and she makes this drive one weekend a month out of devotion to her dad. She gets in her car, feels a little tired, and decides to stop for a caffeine jolt and to pick up her dad's favorite donuts. She drinks the coffee, feels the liquid instantly warm her chest, and hits the highway.
It creates this sense of total security.
But I was actually getting frustrated reading this part. Like, we know a crash is coming. The book is literally about an ICU bedside.
Right, you're just waiting for it.
Exactly. So why are we spending a whole page talking about Wendy the secretary, the exact population of Alexandria, and stopping to buy donuts? It felt like it was killing the momentum. Here's where it gets really interesting. Is there a structural reason for slowing the pace down with these incredibly mundane details right before a life-shattering event?
Oh, absolutely. It is actually a brilliant manipulation of the reader's psychology, and it mirrors the neuroscience of trauma.
Really? How so?
Well, think about how the brain processes a sudden shock. It relies on the contrast principle. The author specifically points out the feeling of the warm coffee in Lucy's chest. That warmth represents an internal baseline of comfort, routine, and safety.
I see.
Yeah, by stretching out that feeling of normalcy, the author lulls your nervous system into the same false sense of security that Lucy is feeling.
So when the impact happens, the whiplash isn't just physical for the character, it is psychological for the reader.
Precisely. If we didn't have the mundane details of the donuts and the warm coffee, the crash wouldn't feel nearly as devastating. The brain measures the severity of a trauma by the gap between expectation and reality.
The reality she slams into is just brutal. About an hour into the drive, this thick white fog rolls in. Visibility just plummets.
It's terrifying.
Out of nowhere, a vehicle swings into her lane, heading for a head-on collision. Lucy instinctively veers right, swerves, loses control, and the text describes this terrifying moment where everything goes into slow motion. Images of her family flash in her mind right before her car slams head-on into an electric pole.
You notice how the narrative shifts from that warm internal comfort to an overwhelming assault of cold external sensory detail.
It is a complete sensory overload. We are told about the deafening sounds of bent metal and shattering glass. The airbag deploys and hits her square in the face, knocking the wind out of her. Her head crashes back into the headrest, jerking her neck hard before she loses consciousness.
Yeah, the violence of it is jarring.
But there is one detail in this sequence that just makes your blood run cold. The other vehicle, the one that forced her off the road, stops for a split second
This part.
and then just drives away.
It is a profound violation of the social contract.
It is pure cowardice, but it also immediately changes the trajectory of the story.
It does, because structurally, that cowardly act forces the narrative outward. When that driver leaves, Lucy is entirely alone, trapped, and unconscious. We can no longer follow her internal monologue.
Right, because she's out cold.
Exactly. The story has to pivot from the isolated, silent crash site in the fog to the frantic external rescue effort.
And that triggers this desperate chain reaction. A passing driver finds her and calls 911. First responders arrive, and it takes the firemen 10 agonizing minutes of painstaking care just to extract her from the mangled wreckage.
10 minutes feels like a lifetime in that situation.
It really does. They rush her to the emergency room of the General Hospital. The police find her information, and the hospital attempts to call her home. But her husband, Mark, is working late on a huge court case and misses the initial call.
Which just ratchets up the tension because you, the audience, know the devastation that is coming his way, and he is just sitting at his desk completely oblivious.
Completely. When Mark finally gets the news, his reaction is this instant plunge into panic. He dashes to his car, facing an hour-and-a-half drive to the hospital. And as you read this sequence, put yourself in Mark's shoes for a second. You are driving down the highway toward your absolute worst nightmare. You're falling apart. But you're also the hub of the family wheel.
Oh, man, yeah.
I kept thinking of Mark as like a tragic air traffic controller.
That is a fascinating way to look at his role.
Right. He has to safely land these devastating emotional payloads on the rest of the family while his own world is actively crashing. He tries to call Lucy's father, Lucas, on the Bluetooth. No answer. So he has to call Danny, the eldest of Lucy's 4 children from a previous marriage.
Which is just an awful burden.
It is. Mark has to break the news, hear Danny cry, and then rely on Danny and his wife Emily to notify the other siblings, Ryan, Dwayne, and Johnny. Mark is forced to manage everyone else's trauma while he is utterly incapable of managing his own.
And the climax of that impossible responsibility comes when Lucas finally returns Mark's call.
Oh, that phone call is excruciating to read. Mark answers, and Lucas is practically bubbling with excitement. He says, Lucy hasn't arrived yet, but she should pull in any time.
It breaks your heart.
And then Lucas proudly announces he ordered Lucy's favorite supper and set the table. He is living in that same safe, comfortable reality Lucy was in an hour ago. And Mark has to systematically dismantle that joy. He tells him there has been a horrendous accident and Lucy is in a coma. Lucas just shatters. He cries out, "No, no, not my little girl."
If we connect this to the bigger picture of how humans process catastrophe, the author highlights a brilliant dichotomy here. On one hand, you have the clinical, almost mechanical efficiency of the hospital.
Yeah, it's very stark.
Right. Dr. Wright, the neurologist, introduces himself. They are running an MRI. They are measuring the severe swelling around her brain. They outline a critical 24-hour window. It is cold, it is factual, and it is protocol.
The hospital is functioning exactly as it is designed to. They have metrics and scans.
But juxtaposed directly against that clinical efficiency is the absolute messy human helplessness of Mark and Lucas. The doctors have actionable data. Mark and Lucas only have their fear. They are left crying in their cars, begging God for mercy, completely stripped of any agency.
You feel that powerlessness so sharply.
Yeah.
When Lucas arrives at the emergency doors, he is described as gasping for breath, telling a nurse he has seen better days. He is a father who's used to protecting his daughter, and suddenly there's absolutely nothing practical he can do. The medical trauma is out of his hands.
Which drives the final, most poignant scene in these excerpts.
Exactly. It forces him to the ICU room where he has to find a different way to fight.
Because he has to fight.
Lucas slowly opens the door. He sees Lucy lying motionless. She looks frail in this blue-green hospital gown attached to a web of wires and machines. Mark relays the doctor's warning about the next 24 hours, and then Mark actually leaves the room with a nurse to sign police paperwork. Lucas is left entirely alone with his daughter.
The quiet after the storm.
He brushes her hair back. He kisses her forehead. He sits down, grasps her hand, and begs her to wake up. He makes a promise to stay right there for as long as she needs him. But the silence of that room is heavy. And remember, the dedication from the very beginning.
When you're sad, fight it.
Yes. Lucas decides to fight the silence. He decides he will talk to her all night long if he has to. He decides to tell her the story of his life, his wondrous childhood, and the story the day he met her mother.
But the way he chooses to tell that story is the most compelling psychological pivot in the entire text.
It's the narrative twist. Lucas deliberately decides that instead of talking about himself in the first person, instead of saying, I remember when I was a boy, or I felt so nervous meeting your mother, he's going to tell his life story in the third person.
As though it happened to a character named Lucas.
Exactly. So what does this all mean? Honestly, I found myself questioning this decision as I read it. Because if my loved one is in a coma and I am desperately trying to reach them, my instinct is to use I. I want to pull them back to me. Isn't telling your own life story in the third person inherently emotionally distant? Why would a grieving father choose to distance himself in the most intimate, desperate moment of his life?
This raises an important question about the psychology of storytelling and what we call self-distancing theory. In moments of acute trauma, the I is terrifying.
Oh, that makes sense.
The first-person perspective is grounded in the present nightmare. If Lucas speaks from the I, he is speaking from the perspective of a terrified, helpless old man sitting in a sterile room listening to a heart monitor. That panic can be paralyzing.
So the third person acts as a psychological buffer.
Exactly. By using the third person, Lucas removes his panicked ego from the room. He elevates the narrative. He takes those raw, painful memories and turns them into a fable. He isn't offering Lucy his current terrified self face. He is offering her a legend.
Wow.
By telling it as if it happened to someone else, he makes the story a shared family history rather than a desperate personal monologue. He knows Lucy will understand it as his story, but stepping outside of himself creates a mythological safe space for her mind to step into. It is a protective barrier against the cold reality of the ICU.
It is profound when you look at it that way.
Yeah.
He is taking the raw data of his own life, putting it through that alchemical process, and forging it into a lifeline for his daughter.
Which brings us completely full circle to the very first page of the book.
Wow, it really does.
Think about what the author told us in the foreword. She took the raw data of her parents' actual lives, including her father Roger's real tears, his real advice to fight sorrow, and she transformed it into this narrative.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah. The fictionalized character of Lucas sitting at the bedside is doing for his daughter exactly what the real author did for her father. They are both using storytelling to preserve the people they love.
The emotional symmetry there is just stunning. We started with the very real-world tears of the author's father and his mandate to fight when you are sad. And we watched that reality seamlessly turn into the fictionalized devotion of Lucas, fighting his daughter's coma with the only weapon he has left, a family history told in the third person.
It shows us that narrative isn't just an escape or a distraction.
No. Sometimes a story is the only mechanism we have to survive when the real world shatters.
It is the architecture of resilience.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive today. But as you go about your day, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Think about the stories your own family tells around the dinner table or at holidays. Are they merely memories? Or are they actually survival tools carefully constructed over generations to keep the family connected when the fog rolls in? And if you found yourself sitting in that quiet, beeping ICU room and you had to tell your own life story to wake a loved one up, would you tell it in the first person, holding tight to your own perspective? Or would you turn it into a third-person epic so the story belongs to them too? Thank you so much for joining us, and we will catch you on the next Deep Dive.